What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 109 of an ongoing series where we basically take the camera anywhere we want and we try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games. First off, I gotta thank Real Sonder for doing this week's animated intro. It was amazing and I loved it. This fella does all sorts of pixel animations over on his Twitter account, so I recommend that you check him out. I'm gonna have a link to that in the video description down below. But are you ready to hear something truly insane? Somehow, Yacht Club Games is a guest on this episode of Boundary Break. They're going to be answering any questions that I have about some of the weirder stuff that I find. And they also provide the camera so that I could do this episode in the first place. This is like unheard levels of accommodation for something like my show. So thank you so much, Yacht Club Games, and let's do right by this gesture, I guess, and make it one heck of an episode. Alright, so fun little story here. I was talking to Codename Gamma, who was trying to make the camera, and he told me that the game runs in a 3D engine, which created problems. Thankfully, like I said a second ago, Yacht Club Games provided the camera, but I was shocked to find out that this game ran in 3D. What? People on Twitter were quick to make note of the fact that the 3DS version does have a depth scale, so maybe it won't be that shocking to everybody, but I'm just serving it out to you from my perspective, and when I found out, my jaw dropped. So I'm going to hand it over to David D'Angelo, who is a programmer that is going to represent Yacht Club Games for the rest of this episode, and just get his explanation as to why the team went with a 3D engine.
I would say the main reason is just because it's easier to set up that way, and when we created the engine originally, we didn't know exactly what we were going to make. We knew we'd probably make a 2D game, but just covering all the bases, having it be in 3D is much easier. You can rely on every console to support that kind of thing nowadays. Really importantly, that if you want to debug something, if you have strictly a 2D engine, it's actually difficult. Having that ability to rotate the camera can make things be easier to figure out what's going wrong. But even though it is a 3D engine, technically, it really is. It's not made for 3D in any way. So what you actually see when you play the game is an orthographic projection, which means essentially it's like it's making 3D objects look 2D.
Over here we got the graps. Now this is really interesting. When the graps are unretracted, they have the tip of the grap as the only existing part of the sprite, but the length of every grap is astounding. Zooming out the camera here, you can see a grap in its entirety, all in one shot. And needless to say, it's pretty long. And what's really peculiar is that there's other objects in the game that have very similar properties, but they function completely differently. Like these platforms that you hit with a switch. Now these retract as well, but when they're retracted, individual squares that make up the platform start to stack like a deck of cards. Unlike the grap, which when that retracts, only the tip remains. Over here in Plague Knight stage, you can see that there's bubbles that rise up through the flasks and everything else. What's really cool about this is that it's just one large texture, and what happens is it seamlessly travels upwards and then warps back down to its original position. I always find stuff like this so fascinating because when done correctly, you'll never notice when it does that reset. And in fact, I even have something that uses this technique in my own show. It's that blue background behind the logo. But also something we haven't talked about yet is how the backdrops work. Now, most of the environment is pretty dynamic and moves with the player, but usually the layer that is the furthest back is a backdrop that just kind of travels with the camera. And so in this stage, the backdrop layer has to change at a certain point. It goes from an outdoors area and gets transformed into a completely different backdrop. And if we pan the camera out here, you can see the exact moment in which the player triggers that change. But by far the coolest thing that I found regarding backgrounds was that for the Battletoads part of the game, there is a segment in which you are hanging from the wires, and it has a Shovel Knight-esque background, but further above that is an unused background that is very similar, if not identical to, the backdrop used in the original Battletoads scene. And so for something as crazy as this, I had to ask the guys at Yacht Club Games, why is this here and why was it never used?
Yeah, so for the Battletoads scenario, what we did is we originally built it with the art from the NES game. We figured, how the heck do we get these scrolling backgrounds that have that sort of ISO view? You know, how do we build the looping layers that show up in the rope section? So we just stamped it down got the art off an emulator or off Google search, and we pulled it right into our game. And after that, we went through the process of making nicer art that fits the Shovel Knight universe. So what you're seeing, I guess, is that we forgot to remove the original art, which hopefully is not in the real build. That might be bad, but because it increases load times and things like that. So it might get removed from further games.
Okay, so maybe I have a little bit of a bias for the Spectre of Torment campaign. Maybe. But I assure you, it's sorely by coincidence that there's a lot to talk about here. For example, before you start anything, the entire screen is monochromatic. Once you press a button, then all of a sudden, all the color comes back. But if we could take the camera outside this scripted scene, you'd see that some layers don't get affected by this script. And so despite the fact that the same foreground layers remain black and white throughout most of this area, you will see a tinge of blue and red here and there, especially with the skulls. And speaking of the skulls, a lot of areas in Spectre of Torment, as well as the other campaigns, will store bonus rooms in the same map just outside the boundaries. So all those scenarios in which you test out your new abilities are stored underneath the map, which makes it all the more appropriate that these two characters jump down instead of any other direction. In fact, there are a ton of rooms stored off to the side as well. And believe it or not, you may be able to recognize some of these rooms. That's because these rooms are used for the tower minigame that's on the left-hand side of this map. But okay, that's unusual. If they're over on the right, what exactly happens when you're trying to scale the tower? Well, as it turns out, you're not actually scaling the entire tower in one shot. Spectre Knight only travels a certain distance up before getting warped back down to a lower position. And so, as you can probably imagine at this point, it's getting a little bit too speculative as to how this all works. So I'm going to hand it back off to Yacht Club Games and see what they have to say.
Essentially, we have all these sections of the level that you can go to that we didn't want to create loading screens or have to have large data in and out coming in that would cause a loading screen, or having to build a whole system to get around the fact that we are loading into new sections. We don't really have a good system for streaming in levels or handling going from one level file to another level file. For going from Pridemoor to Lost City, we have to do a level load at that point, and we didn't really want to do that in the hub area, so we just built everything in the same stage and we set it off to the side, and you just warp there as Spectre Knight, positioning those and loading them above where your character is at any given time. Another fun bit about those is that, all those rooms are off to the side, but they're not exactly the layout of how it appears. They get flipped and changed in various ways to make them seem more random, so we get more variety out of them.
Here are various things that you can find off screen in Shovel Knight. When you defeat Mole Knight, you might remember the fact that a bunch of moles go and grab him and carry him off screen. Well, if you move the camera to the left, you can see that he's just frozen in place just outside the boundaries. The clouds that cover up the overworld map is one large texture, and you can see the very end of it if you keep it on screen and move your character all the way to the right. For whatever reason, in King Knight's boss room, behind the front layer is another throne, and to the left of that is a piece of a throne. In the armor outpost, there's a sign on the other side of this wall indicating that you can leave this way. Now, this is significant because there's not a whole lot of things that are stored outside the boundaries in Shovel Knight, so for there to be a sign has to mean that there at one point was supposed to be an exit on the left-hand side. And over here we got ourselves a viewer request. As always, you can follow me on Twitter if you ever want to leave me a suggestion for a upcoming episode. And this week, one of the best suggestions was what happens to Shovel Knight when he gets rocketed off of the catapult. Well, believe it or not, I had to do multiple takes of this because he kept going much further than I thought he was going to go. But Shovel Knight does travel quite a long distance outside the boundaries, despite the fact that the player would never be able to see that. Another viewer request was to look at the Truple King dance from another angle. And while fulfilling that request, I did see that there was a Truple background element that seems to stay there at all times. I did ask David what exactly was going on here, and even he didn't really know, so we'll just leave that up as a mystery. But yeah, as for the dance itself, there is a ton of Truples that stay on screen once they become visible. David was quoted as saying around 60 of these are on screen at once, which is absurd. The last huge thing that I found was a little bit difficult to find. It was stored behind a whole bunch of layers, and even then, it's kind of hidden away by the void itself. But positioned against the background layer, you can see that there are initials here that say TB, which of course leaves a little bit of a mystery on our hands here. So, David, if you don't mind explaining this one.
What is this? Okay, so in Tinker Knight's stage, the TB that you're seeing there actually is a total accident. So what happens is essentially when we have those breakable tiles, you can see that like when you fight Tinker Knight and you beat him, the floor below him breaks and flies apart. In the level tool, we mark those with this special tile called TB. I forget what it stands for. It's probably just B for breakable, and then we just inserted a T in front of it for whatever reason. Those breakable tiles, we stamp a bunch of those down, and in the level tool, we set those to not show up. But in this case, it seems like we stamped down this tile, and it is showing up. I assume someone created a special kind of tile that was supposed to be breakable and stamped it down in the wrong place and then never saw it and just got left there. It's basically like a bad tile that never got removed from the game. And since it's in the background, no one ever noticed it.
Just want to let you guys know real quick that I'm going to be at the Shorty Awards on May 5th. And outside of that, I'm going to hand it off to David so he can talk to his fans and let you know what's going on. All right, take care.
Just want to say thank you everyone for playing Shovel Knight or reading about it or watching cool videos like this. It's really fun for us to see how, see people just dig into every single aspect of our game. We spent so much time and care putting down every pixel and every slight movement of every character, making it feel just right, and to see that be broken down in videos like this is really cool. And we hope everyone keeps enjoying Shovel Knight and playing it every day, and hopes this inspires you to go back and play some more. We got cool content coming down the pipe. We got King of Cards and Shovel Knight Showdown. They're both amazing and huge, and we hope everyone enjoyed playing them. Take care.